Hello, and welcome to COVID-19, Cities and the Municipal Fiscal Health, part of the Boston University Initiative on Cities ongoing seminar series, and the ways in which COVID-19 pandemic is impacting cities and how local government organizations are responding. I'm Graham Wilson, the co-founder and director of the Initiative on Cities. We know that cities have been stepping up and filling a leadership vacuum that has been left at the federal level. But we also know that cities have been badly hit by the crisis, not only in terms of the appalling health and death toll, but also in terms of the fiscal impact on cities. The demand for services from cities has continued or has increased drastically in some cases during the crisis, but revenues have declined. Revenues from sales taxes, revenues from new buildings coming online with property taxes, etc. So we know that COVID-19 is a fiscal crisis for cities as well as a health crisis. We know that cities are struggling with this crisis, and we know that there has so far been too little help from Washington, D.C. for cities. We await a package for cities that will provide the fiscal help that they desperately need. So this is a really important moment, a crisis moment for cities. And we have with us two absolute experts to talk about this. Christiana McFarland is Research Director for the National League of Cities. That's the body that represents cities of all types in Washington, D.C., and all people who are in leadership positions in cities, mayors, managers, city councillors, etc. And I'm delighted to say that the National League of Cities, and Christy in particular, have been good friends of the Initiative on Cities since we were launched in 2013. We're also joined by Pam Kocher, who is the president of the Boston Municipal Research Bureau. The Municipal Research Bureau is almost 100 years old. It was founded originally to be a fiscal watchdog and to watch out for profligacy by city leaders. But over the years, it has evolved into something much more, a leading setting for the discussion of issues and policy problems confronting Boston and the surrounding area. It's very much part of the infrastructure of the civic life of our city, and we're delighted to have Pam with us. Pam is another old friend of the Initiative on Cities, and I'm delighted to say that she's a PU graduate, a terrier, and we're thrilled to have her with us today. Christy is going to start off the conversation, but before we do that, my colleague David Gross is going to do some housekeeping and tell you about how the session will be run on the technical side, so you can join in and ask questions. David.
Hi everyone, my name is David Gross, and I am the program manager and, I'm the program manager and administrator for the Boston University Initiative on Cities. Today's session is going to be recorded, so and we're also simulcasting this live on Facebook Live. We will put the recording up on YouTube after this, and you'll also be able to access it using the Zoom link that you used to watch this session immediately afterwards, if you'd like to. We will hold a Q&A session after Christy and Pam have spoken. But at any time during the webinar, you can use the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your Zoom window, to submit a question. If someone else has submitted a question that you find interesting or that you would have asked yourself, you can upvote those questions instead of asking a duplicate. And we'll do our best at the end to get through as many questions as possible. And with that, I'll leave it over to Christy, and we can get started.
Thank you, David, and welcome from Washington, D.C. Christy, over to you.
Great, well, thank you so much. Because of slight technical difficulties, I think that David's going to advance my slides, so appreciate that. Again, David and Graham, thank you so much for having me here today for this critical discussion. My goal is to set the stage about what is happening in cities, towns,
Oh,
Oh, can you hear me?
we
we
lost
can now.
just for a second, Christy. Sorry.
Okay. Sorry about that. As I was saying, my goal today really is to set the stage for how the pandemic recession, I think as it's being known at this point, is having fiscal impacts on cities, towns, and villages across the country. In terms of a general overview, I'll start with sort of city finances before COVID-19. So what was the general landscape around city fiscal health prior to what we're seeing now? Then transition into how the pandemic recession is impacting city finances, both in the immediate term as well as what cities anticipate over the next year or two. And also think about how this then has additional implication for us. And lastly, thinking about what is the sort of the general response and what do we do about this? Okay, you can advance to the next slide. So over the next couple of slides, I'm going to share some of the information from a survey that NLC has been conducting for the past 35 years called the City Fiscal Conditions Survey. It's very helpful for not only national cities, but cities nationwide to understand the trends in city revenues and expenditures, key factors that are impacting city budgets, as well as the capacity of city budgets to meet the needs of the residents and businesses in their communities. So in this particular chart, we're assessing year-over-year changes in the general fund budget of cities, which, as you know, is the primary operating budget for cities. And the green line represents revenues, the yellow line represents expenditures. This chart shows that these trends stretching back to 1986, meaning we're able to see how city finances have responded to major economic recessions, stretching all the way back to that time, primarily recessions occurring in 91, 2001, as well as the most recent Great Recession. You know, when we know that city finances took the greatest hit in the most recent recession, the Great Recession, 2008 and 9, the impacts of which were both much more substantial in terms of depth and duration than previous recessions. City revenues only began their path to recovery in 2011, hitting what we see as sort of a revenue growth peak in 2015. And since that time, revenue growth has been slowing or plateauing. So again, we're not necessarily seeing a decline, but we're seeing sort of a stabilization or a leveling out following 2015. Meanwhile, we know expenditures continue to grow and in some cases outpace revenues. Turning to the next slide, it's also important to dig a little bit deeper on the revenue side, in particular to get a handle on how revenues in particular respond to the economic conditions in communities across the country. So this chart represents year-over-year growth of revenue from property taxes, which is the yellow line, sales taxes, the blue line, and income taxes, which is the purple line. Coming into 2020, we know that all major sources of revenue, again, are continuing to grow more slowly than we've seen in the past few years. A city that relies on property taxes, like most in the Northeast, typically will not experience such an immediate collapse in its revenues. We know that local assessment practices require that cities wait to estimate the value of land and property until the property is exchanged on the market or an assessment is conducted. Current property tax bills, for example, typically reflect the value of property anywhere from 18 months to several years prior to its collection. So you can see that after the 2001 recession, property taxes continued to grow but then decline. In 2008, because of the source of the recession was the real estate market crash, they were affected much sooner. With the current economic challenges, we anticipate that rising unemployment will dampen real estate demand. People will not be able to pay property tax bills, as Graham had mentioned at the onset, building is going to slow as well. So I think there's this overall sense that although property tax dependent cities will feel the fiscal impacts a little bit later than other cities who are relying on the sales and income taxes, they will still feel those COVID-19 impacts sooner than they typically would in a typical recession. Turning to the next slide. This is just a quote which sort of encapsulates our feelings about city fiscal conditions at the end of 2019 when we released the last report. And again, there was just a general sense that city fiscal conditions were stabilizing after 2015. Cities certainly being conservative coming into, I think it was the 11th year of expansion, thinking about how they continue to save and be conservative in terms of their fiscal practices. One thing we also note, of course, is that although we present a national snapshot, we know that economies are regional and fiscal structures are different depending on the state that the city resides in. So from place to place, we're going to see the impact of economic conditions obviously play out differently across the country and cities in very different ways. But really to underscore the intersection between fiscal structure and the economy, of course, which is critical for understaging now. In terms of some subsequent analysis that I recently conducted with my co-author on that City Fiscal Condition Survey, Mike Pagano, we really wanted to dig a little bit deeper to understand, okay, which cities are reliant on sources that tend to respond pretty quickly to the economy, so that's sales and income taxes, and how does that overlay with what their economy looks like? Are they, do they have a large share of jobs in industries that are very vulnerable, particularly in this specific COVID-19 economy? So when we say sort of vulnerable industries, we're talking about things like mining and oil and gas, transportation, employment services, travel, hospitality, tourism. And this was an analysis that was conducted by Moody's and then additional analysis by Brookings. And we overlaid the fiscal structure on top of what those economic structures look like locally for communities. So we know that cities with both vulnerable economic composition as a structure that's highly reliant on elastic sources will feel a dip in revenues more quickly than those with alternative economic and fiscal structures. So this really is kind of a recipe for disaster. And we're seeing that, so we assessed about 150 cities or so. You'll notice that a lot of these cities are in Ohio. A big reason for that is because Ohio cities have a very high reliance on income tax in particular. We've heard recent stories about Akron, for example. We'll talk about municipal employment, but laying off huge swaths of their employees and so forth. So we're starting to really see how this fiscal structure and economic structure in communities is really having a very tangible, immediate impact, particularly in those places that are reliant on very elastic sources of revenue. Moving to the next slide, you can see that, again, there's a heavy concentration of communities that are more immediately affected in the Midwest, again, due to revenue structure and economic structure. Sample, and David, you could advance to the next slide. Beyond the sample that we examined in that particular analysis, we really wanted to get a general sense of how are cities across the country faring. So we partnered with the U.S. Conference of Mayors. We received responses from nearly 2,500 cities of all sizes. And we asked them a host of questions related to the fiscal impact of COVID-19. Level, we wanted to have an understanding of whether, from a revenue standpoint as well as an expenditure standpoint, what are some of the budget impacts that they anticipate feeling. Nearly decline at least at some point this year. We see that's 100% for all municipalities above 200,000, 98% for municipalities above 50,000. And 87% of municipalities less than 50,000 in population anticipate a revenue shortfall. That's just important to keep in mind because what we're seeing obviously is sort of widespread fiscal impact, and obviously the extent or the depths of those impacts are going to vary again depending on fiscal structure, economic structure, as well as the incidences of COVID-19 that are occurring in particular communities. But we know that regardless, because of the mass shutdown of the economy writ large, cities of all sizes across the country are feeling the pain. So what does this translate to? Clearly, cities need most often, obviously, as their reserves and their rainy day funds. Beyond that, obviously, that can only go so far, although cities have been relatively conservative and have been saving pretty extensively over the past 10 years or so. But what we're seeing is that as reserves sort of diminish because they're being used in these first couple of months, because cities are on the front lines and need to respond in very critical ways in real time, as cities are coming up on balancing their budgets and figuring out how they're going to make that work, cities are turning to deep service cuts. There's the opportunity, obviously, to raise taxes, which both from a political standpoint is not necessarily feasible right now, to put the burden back on residents and businesses in the community. And additionally, cities across the country are very constrained in terms of the revenue raising authorities that they do have. So many places just don't have the option to utilize particular revenue raising tools. So what that leaves is service cuts. And when we talk about what service and budget cuts mean to a municipality, we're talking about the municipal workforce. It's the people who work for cities that are conducting those services and providing those services to their communities. So to better understand how fiscal impacts are impacting municipal workforces across the country, we analyze municipal employment data from the annual survey of public employment and payroll, along with the budget impact data that we received from the NLC USCM survey. There are about 3 million municipal employees across the country. Based on our extensive scan of how cities were responding in a more qualitative sense, from a research perspective, we recognize that cities that were facing revenue shortfalls were having impacts for enforced fiscal actions, including layoffs, furloughs, pay cuts, and hiring freezes, in the magnitude of roughly 10% to 33%, affecting the municipal workforce. So, for example, over 25% of the municipal workforce in the city of Tulsa, 15% in Aurora, Colorado, 30% in Oxford, Mississippi are being furloughed. We know in Portland, nearly 35% of the city's workforce is being affected by budget cuts, with layoffs for nearly 1,000 employees, furloughs and pay freezes for another 1,700. So the effects are very widespread, and again, range typically from 10 to 33%, and that includes everything from layoffs and furloughs, which are some common actions, pay cuts, all the way through hiring freezes. And we know that these employment impacts are significant. Again, municipal employees are providing the services that our communities need right now. There also tend to be sort of the bread and butter of America's middle class. Just thinking about, who are municipal employees and how are they, and thinking about their salaries and what that means in terms of subsequent effects on communities and the economy going forward. So what do we do about all of this? Turning to a response. As I mentioned previously, most cities are required to balance their budgets. They have significant revenue raising restrictions. There's a relationship between the city and states, obviously, where the states are dictating much of the opportunities and options for cities. We know sort of another sort of circumstance that cities are in right now is meeting the immediate needs of the residents and businesses in their communities, whether that's property tax deferments or foregoing business license fees, for example. But all of these positive fiscal actions that benefit residents and businesses also have negative fiscal consequences for cities. So these are the hard decisions that cities are being forced to make, particularly in the absence of additional support from the federal government. So this is why NLC is calling on the federal government to help cities of all sizes, not only for immediate COVID-related expenses, but also to support revenue shortfalls that are due to the economic circumstances surrounding COVID-19. So with that, I want to close and turn it back over to Graham.
Thank you so much. That was very insightful and also very worrying. We are, of course, going to have questions, but we're going to save the questions until after our second speaker, Pam Kocher of the Boston Municipal Research Bureau. Pam, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Shall I see if I can share my screen now?
Please do.
Okay. Let's see.
There we go.
Okay. There. Do we now have full screen?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. So my presentation starts with the words unprecedented uncertainty. In Boston, we were talking until just less than 2 months ago about unprecedented economic good times, incredible times for the city of Boston since the Great Recession, due to the mix of different types of business and industry we have in the city, and the city economically was really doing very well on many fronts. And so what we've seen in Boston in particular is just this sort of dramatic cliff drop from unprecedented resources for the city and unprecedented economic success across for the city, although obviously not for everyone within our community. And here we are now with a whole different situation. And we're looking at this in the basic structure of how long does the public health crisis last? What are the impacts on the community, on the local economy, on local government finances, and how do we address those now and into the coming years? And I just want to emphasize, as I talk about I'm talking about the longer the public health crisis lasts. That does not mean that I'm somebody who wants to make that very unsafe trade-off of opening the Boston economy before it's appropriate to do so in terms of public health. In fact, my Boston University degree that Graham mentioned was a master's in public health with a focus on epidemiology, just the kind of analysis that our public health colleagues are doing today to figure out the challenges of the current COVID-19 crisis and how to respond to those. So let me take you just a little bit forward. We've got a couple of visuals coming up as well. So the city put out its first proposed budget to start off the beginning of Boston's budget process for the coming fiscal year that starts July 1st. And they had laid out what their understanding was about the challenge ahead from COVID-19 by the end of March and into early April, before the mayor presented his budget on April 8th. So just to keep in mind as we go through this, the city was working on its financial picture going forward and what it would need to do to respond based on very early information that we had to help us understand what we were entering into in terms of challenges for the community and its finances. So the slide I have here is the city's perspective, or sort of the structure that they're using to think about what are sort of the knowns that are happening globally, locally, state and federally, and then what are the unknowns, and so therefore some of the potential additional exposures that we don't know how large they will be, and how significant an impact they will have on Boston going forward. So they've got in mind the global economy, revenue growth slowing. Boston is, as you'll hear more in a few minutes, Boston is well positioned to confront the uncertainty, at least as the city budget folks understood it, again, as of early April. But then there are those unknowns of what will happen in terms of having to keep our economy closed, what will the recovery look like, how long that will take, and what are our new fiscal realities, and how will the state and federal government help cities and towns, particularly cities like Boston in this case, how will they help us react to any dramatic changes into our fiscal realities? So here's a photo from Monday afternoon. This is not our city hall, this is Boston's State House. So that's where our state officials are, including our governor. There was a large crowd that came down to protest the continued hold on all business and community activities, and the emphasis on people staying home. As we've seen across the country, there are some in Boston and the Massachusetts area that are really frustrated and very much struggling economically because of the current shutdown. So they came to Boston to express that. Very few or no face masks visible in the crowd. And then, so that was Monday. Yesterday morning, this is what showed up on the front steps of the State House. Again, same spot where people like to do their protesting. And it's an old car, all painted up, and that is some sort of dramatic gondola. On the back, it has copper wings, and it was somebody really spent a lot of time putting together this piece of, I guess, artwork for another protest. But you can see that in this case, this bright orange figure happens to be wearing a face mask. So good progress there. And hopefully we'll see more of that as the folks who are frustrated about our challenges economically right now can hopefully find a safe space to meet with our public health officials and our city government leaders to figure out how and when the economy can be opened again safely for all. And then one more photo. This was also yesterday afternoon. This is one of Boston's biggest thoroughfares downtown, Congress Street. And as is the case, I'm sure, in many of your communities, you could pretty much, you know, walk around in the city streets without getting into any sort of trouble because it's so quiet out there. So thinking about Boston's fiscal health under these conditions, the city budget process, as I refer to it, has the mayor propose his first recommended budget to the city council on April 8th, which was done. Our city council is now in the process of holding hearings on all aspects of the budget and the city's department operations. And they're doing that virtually, doing it remotely using Zoom as we are today. And so they will be doing that until the end of May, early June, at which time the city council will reject the mayor's budget, and the mayor will then have an opportunity to resubmit a budget with some adjustments. That's the case every year. This year, that's particularly important for Boston because, as I mentioned, the mayor was able to only put out his budget in April with limited information about the evolving situation, and we've certainly seen it evolve quite a bit since. So here we are looking at the past 6 or so years. Boston comes to this crisis with very significant financial strength. As you see here on the slide, Boston's property tax revenue grew by 78.4% from fiscal year 13 to 19. So dramatic, unprecedented increase in resources from property taxes. That is what we're seeing because of that dramatic value increase. For that, and also long-term good fiscal stewardship by city budget officials and finance officials, the city has enjoyed a AAA bond rating for 6 years in a row, and Moody's recognized Boston as one of the cities most prepared for a recession. That supposition is certainly being tested now and will be most likely in the next couple of years, depending on how things unfold. The city officials' bottom line is that our underlying fiscal conditions are strong, but of course, significant caution is needed. So then we'll move along. Hang on just a moment. So here's a look at our property tax base and why we are seeing such substantial increase in property tax revenues in Boston. In this chart, the bottom row, which is in blue, that represents the amount of revenue increases year to year from existing property base. So current properties in Boston. The orange row that runs along on top of that is the increased revenue from development of property into new buildings, both commercial and in new homes, as well as renovations and other improvements to existing property. So what we're seeing with the unprecedented economic boom that the city has been experiencing, there has been a lot of construction, a lot of development. And the city in recent years has been at a point where the revenue that it's able to capture from that new construction, that new development, is more than the city is receiving from its taxation of its property tax base. So this has been a pretty unusual special circumstance. Boston's had a great run, but of course we need to be very careful about what might happen going forward. So a little bit more about the property tax base that you're seeing. A key part of that development that is producing substantial new revenue for city coffers comes from our Seaport District area. On the left, you see a picture from the early days when this area was first starting to be developed. This isn't that long ago. Work started out there, in the early 2000s, but predominantly that area of our city remained mostly parking lots for many, many years. And now if you look at the photo on the right, that's what that neighborhood looks like today. There has been rapid, intense development in that area. So very few parking lots, if any, left. A lot going on down there now in terms of commercial property, in terms of residential property. And so that dramatic development of that, what used to be an open area of the city, is really what played a huge role in Boston's newly expanded property tax base. And we are going to have to rely on that going forward. The city proposed a $3.6 billion budget for fiscal year 21. That includes $3.6 billion in recurring revenue. And these are all revenues that we've got our eye on right now, given the current economic uncertainty. The property tax, state aid, excise taxes, which is a bucket that includes some some non-property taxes that are highly impacted by changes in consumption and changes in the economy. So for example, the property tax is 72% of the city's revenue. There's some dynamics about how Massachusetts and therefore Boston's property taxes work, such that there's a lag between, for example, a time when city property taxes might not grow as rapidly, or property values might only increase a little bit per year instead of at the rapid rate they have to date. And or even if our properties lost values. And the dynamic there is the lag time means that the market conditions we might see in 2020 as we wrap up this year with the crisis in full blow, if that impacts property values, or if in fiscal year 21 there's an impact on a negative impact on property values, city finances wouldn't see that for well over a year and a half because of the timing of when the city assesses property and when they implement those updated property values. Local revenues, as I mentioned, a number of them closely linked to the economy. These are our excise taxes, which are $188 million of the city budget. We have a local meals tax, local hotel and motel rooms tax, tax on motor vehicles, and aircraft fuel, so jet fuel, because we have that big Logan Airport in the city of Boston. A lot of planes used to be coming in and out of there. And you can certainly imagine few people are going out for meals, if anybody these days, usually takeout, if at all. Our hotels and motels in the city are closed. Some might be being housed to support frontline workers that should not be at home with their families. Folks aren't necessarily buying new cars at the moment. Again, looking at our local revenues, here's a little chart that shows the lighter blue what those revenues were, for example, for hotel motel occupancy taxes, meals, motor vehicles, jet fuel last year, and the drop since. We've seen, well, we project a decline based on, again, that March and early April information, a decline of $20 million total for these 4 excise taxes. And we'll be seeing, I'm sure the city will be updating those based on the more current information they have by June, where they'll know for real what happened in March and April, and to a little bit hopefully in May. Some of the other fiscal challenges that may hit Boston. Boston has a payment in lieu of taxes program for large nonprofits in the city. That includes some of our colleges and universities, hospitals, and cultural institutions. In the Great Recession, those institutions all did relatively well, stood up relatively well. However, in the current crisis, what we're seeing is massive disruption for colleges and universities, as all of you are probably seeing in your communities, as well as the hospitals, as they've had to stop doing regular procedures that generate revenue and focus very much on the current health crisis. And then cultural institutions as well, essentially shut down. Some are planning to be shut down through the summer. So we are seeing these entities that make voluntary payments at their discretion to the city struggling, and there's some question about whether they will be able to make the requested payments by the city going into the coming fiscal year. A couple of other areas where Boston can expect some fiscal challenges is state aid. State aid to Boston has decreased over the past 2 decades. It's a smaller percentage of the city budget in recent years, down from 30% to 13%. And yet now the state has its own revenue challenges. And we could say perhaps theirs are at the moment more severe, and they are more at risk for state finances well-being than perhaps Boston is at this moment. So state leaders are now revisiting their revenue assumptions that they made back in December 29, and they're struggling to come to an agreement on what the state revenue assumption should be. That then leads the governor, the House of Representatives, and the state Senate through a coordinated dance to get them to the end of the state budget process. It may well lead to reduced support from the state that we usually expect for cities and towns, including Boston. Lottery revenue is another item that's traditionally a source of support for state aid to cities and towns, supports some of the programs that do deliver that additional support from the state to Boston. The state also enacted a new education funding entity. It's called something called the Student Opportunity Act. Folks were very excited to start to see this new revenue come to the city and support our Boston public schools. Now there's much question about whether that new program can and should be implemented given the current financial condition of our state. And then as well, state sales taxes have an impact on resources for cities such as Boston. In particular, state sales tax helps support the state school building program, where it subsidizes school buildings in cities and towns. Boston is taking advantage in recent years of that program, but now, of course, there's some question about whether the state will have revenue in that program that the city was looking to benefit from as the city looks to overhaul a number of its schools. And then as well, as of the April budget, there is focus by the city on limiting the spending growth, but continuing to fund some major investments. Some of these, as the Research Bureau, we are happy to see, such as the city sticking with making payments to continue to fully fund fixed costs like pensions and debt service. The city has increased public health funding for our Boston Public Health Commission by $9 million. Good chance that if that's what the expectation was back in April, we may see that there's significantly more resources needed to support response to the public health crisis now. And then also the city is looking to make some education and housing investments. And then some additional targeted investments based on some cost savings, including successful negotiations with city employees to adjust healthcare plan design, including adding a new deductible for the first time, which is netting the city a good amount of money to provide support. As I had mentioned, the fiscal year 21 budget process has been underway. The mayor will make that final budget proposal in June. Of course, we expect it to be a revised budget with some probably much more conservative expectations about revenues and efforts to address most likely some significantly increased financial expenditures. The city is focusing certainly on how quickly and to what extent economic activity in the city can resume. The city needs to also be looking at the challenges that are likely to come around food insecurity and housing insecurity, employment insecurity, and access to health care, both for those in our community who have been challenged by those issues for some time and may be feeling it even more severely, or members of our community who, because of recent loss of jobs and or housing, are becoming economically insecure for perhaps the first time and may need some additional supports that might come from a number of sources, including some support around city, state, federal, and nonprofit leaders. We'll also expect to see this June budget proposal by the mayor provide more updated information on updated expectations on what the state might be able to provide for the city, and also more clarity on the potential for federal funding for the city's recovery, both the city itself and the members of the city, the community, the residents, and our businesses, both large and small, that call Boston home. So the next stage the city's already starting to think about is what's the recovery work ahead, and what that means for the city. Now this picture is from a physical, the physical impact of a weather-related crisis in a community in Nebraska. We often have talked in recent years about recovery when we talk about the impacts of hurricanes or major storms like Sandy. And some of the folks at the Boston Public Schools and I found we were starting to use the word recovery work as well for this particular crisis, because while it's not, the threat of the virus is not visible, there's a lot of recovery work to be done ahead, certainly. As we think in particular about the Boston Public Schools, it's how do we recover some of that lost learning time for students and address perhaps some increased challenges to their well-being and help them get settled back into their new normal and back to classrooms, ideally by the fall. And we know that there are similar challenges and recovery work needed and recovery support for other aspects of our city, of our community, that are going to be critical in the coming months and perhaps coming year or two. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pam. We have a number of people who want to ask questions, but I'm going to use my power as moderator and throw in a quick question. Christy, you set out the fact that all cities are going to feel a fiscal impact, some very, very quickly, resulting in some very big layoffs in those cities that are affected quickly. But cities aren't generally in the luxury good business. They provide essential services. So what has Washington done, and what do we hope that Washington will do to help cities in this crisis?
Yeah, thank you, Graham. It's a critically important question. What we have seen so far was through the first CARES Act, the federal government had provided a limited amount of funding to cities and states directly to handle expenditures related specifically to response to COVID-19. So that does not include revenue shortfalls as a result of economic challenges. And you know, from a National League of Cities standpoint, from I think sort of a city fiscal health standpoint, we had two major, we were very happy to see any funding coming out of Washington, of course. And we noted sort of two significant problems or challenges related with the structure of that initial sort of quote unquote stimulus from the federal government. The first was that funding for cities was only directed towards cities above 500,000 in population. That's a very limited subset of about 35 cities across the country. Obviously, that's where those communities house a large share of our nation's population. So from that perspective, is very positive. But I think understanding that the revenue impacts are going to be felt much more broadly, we feel very strongly that cities across the board should be receiving and have direct funding from the federal government. Additionally, there were some significant restrictions in the usage of the funding that was coming from the federal government. Primarily in that the funding from the federal government was only to be used for COVID-related expenses for cities that primarily would be sort of overtime expenses related to frontline personnel and so forth, but did not necessarily allow for revenue loss recovery. And again, many communities across the country are seeing revenue losses because of the economic impact that COVID-19 is having across the country. So again, I'm looking towards the next stimulus or support from the federal government to include support to a much broader share of city governments across the country, as well as providing that flexibility in terms of allowing those who are on the front lines to really understand how best to use the funds that are coming from the federal government.
Thank you. And perhaps following on from that, Julie asks or makes the comment, the vulnerable cities seem to be mainly, certainly often in red states. And what's the implication of that? And similarly, as you've emphasized, what help we have seen so far has gone to the very largest cities. So obviously a lot of Americans live in small to mid-sized cities.
Yeah, correct. So I think, you know, we're continuing to do sort of fiscal impact analysis and really understand what the broader sort of depths of the fiscal impact will look like. You know, initial indications also are pointing to a broad fiscal impact in those very communities where we're seeing some political support that is not as strong as we would like to see for direct aid to cities and towns across the country. So, you know, it is, you know, I think it definitely is an important point to make that those places that are struggling most need that support coming out of Washington. And I would note also, I think another question had come in related specifically to sort of why are we seeing some property tax and revenue overall softening before even coming into 2020? A lot of that has to do with communities in the Midwest and still not having fully recovered coming out of the Great Recession. And again, those are still the very same communities that we're seeing. So the same communities that one, particularly maybe in red states, two, have sort of a revenue and economic structure that is making them very hard hit right now in COVID-19. Those are also the same communities that were economically disadvantaged coming into the current economic crisis. So, you know, the Midwest obviously is still going to continue to have its share of challenges.
Pam, maybe you've got some ideas on this. Claire asks if there are municipal expense categories that will be drawn on less because of COVID-19's effects on municipal life. Are there any areas you can think of where COVID would actually result in savings in terms of expenditure? I'm trying to think of any myself, and I haven't succeeded, but maybe you can.
I'm not sure I would say we can anticipate savings. I think it more might be that in some cases, there might be a decision to delay a certain project or implementation of a new program, and that might lead to a shift and using the resources intended for taking on a new program to be shifted to meet current existing needs, particularly fundamental needs of a city's residents.
Yeah, I suppose that fuel costs will be going down, and that may be a
That's true,
saving,
yeah.
but that's the only one that I've succeeded in thinking of myself so far. Christy, looking at the other side of that, what are the areas that you would suggest where there's been a particular increase in costs for cities because of COVID?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we've seen in particular are, although we're seeing on one hand, cuts in expenses related to municipal employment, we're also seeing significant increases as well for overtime, emergency pay, and so forth, and that really is a significant cost for cities and towns across the country.
And maybe a question for both of you, although Randy asks this for Christy originally. He makes the comment that many cities have archaic tax policies that need reform. Any evidence that this crisis might result in pursuing what Randy describes as sensible 21st century tax reform? Although I'd have to say that I've always thought that income tax was in principle better than property tax, but it's the income tax cities that are going to be hit very hard very quickly. Anyway, comments from both of you on that.
Yes, it's one reason we are seeing the state of Massachusetts feeling more of an immediate concern about its finances and ability to address the crisis is because their taxes are relying on income tax and sales tax, whereas the city of Boston and local governments across Massachusetts do have that foundation of the property tax. There are other ways and other circumstances that a local government in Massachusetts, their property taxes may be a challenge to gather sufficient revenue. There are some unusual circumstances, but at the moment in Massachusetts, I think we're finding that not so bad that in Boston, the property tax takes up 72% of our revenue. But as I mentioned in my presentation, if there are negative impacts on property taxes, we would likely see that in the next coming years. We might see that hit the city's finances.
Christy, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the way that fiscal structures are organized, I mean, in most places we would call for a balance between revenue sources because each revenue source is intended to act as a buffer on the other. So whether you have a reliance or at least some share of your revenues coming from more elastic sources like sales and income tax as opposed to inelastic sources like property tax, when one goes down, the other should go up and sort of create a nice buffer. That's sort of I think the dream, right? But I think we see a lot of places, for example, like in Boston, Massachusetts, where there's an over-reliance potentially on the property tax, which can then lead to challenges around, revenues from nonprofit institutions and so forth. Whereas then you also have, on the other hand, places like Ohio where there's an over-reliance on the income tax. I think what we would call for is, one, a more balanced approach to the fiscal structure, as well as thinking about alternative revenues that would be available to cities across the country. And of course, that's sort of an ongoing conversation to more closely align the fiscal structure with the economy. And some of that has been resolved in recent years, but hasn't necessarily trickled down, including online sales tax and so forth. So, I think as these conversations continue around the fiscal impact on cities, it's great to see that the conversations around the fiscal structure actually is rising to the top. in ways that it hasn't before. So thank you for the question.
I'm going to squeeze in one last question. Harry points out that we're living in a period of considerable uncertainty and says, could we have 6-month budgets rather than annual budgets? I know that we in the university are just trying to cope with incredible uncertainty about, for example, will there be a full semester? So could we have 6-month budgets instead of annual budgets?
Yeah, hi, this is Pam. I think that would take an act of the legislature to allow cities and towns to do that. There are a number of things before the legislature, some that we're hoping would be passed that will help cities and towns with these challenges. The state itself is able to do do 1-month budgets to keep it going until they get the legislature and the governor fully in alignment on passing a final state budget. But we expect there are some options for cities and towns, and wouldn't be surprised under the current circumstances if the state looks to provide additional options for cities and towns who are who think that going on a shorter budget year very temporarily might be helpful.
Well, thank you. With apologies to Joseph, who was hoping to get in another question, I note that we have reached the end of the hour. We are going to have to wrap things up. I want to thank Pam and Christy for joining us and giving us their time and expertise. And I want to ask David, my colleague, just to tell us about the upcoming seminars in the series.
Thank you, Graham. And just Pam and Christy, if you are able to, you can access the Q&A tab and you can type an answer to any of the remaining questions. Don't feel, I'm not sure if it'll work for you, but if you can, then you can squeeze in a couple. But I do want to let everyone know that we do have some more webinars upcoming. In this series. Next Wednesday at 1 o'clock, we'll be discussing pollution in the environment, especially the implications for the future of environmental policy. We'll have David Miller, who's the director of C40's, the director of international diplomacy for C40's Cities Climate Leadership Group, as well as Lucy Hutira, excuse me, who's an associate professor of Earth and Environment here at BU.
I'll just note that David was also mayor of Toronto, so he knows it from the sharp end.
Exactly, yeah, thanks for adding that. Yes, and also has worked for WWF, was heading WWF in Canada as well. On May 27th, also Wednesday at 1 o'clock, we're gonna be discussing how cities are supporting aging populations, as well as some challenges and trends that aging populations face as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Obviously, there's health-related aspects, but there's many aspects that go beyond health as well, or we go beyond infection with COVID-19 and that risk as well. I will have Bronwyn Keith, who is the director of the Center for Aging and Disability Research, Education and Research at Boston University, as well as Anton Watson, who's the age-friendly director at the AARP, Massachusetts. And I would like to add that we may have another webinar on May 20th, although that remains to be seen. We're in the planning stages. And we're finalizing some additional webinars as well. You can visit bu.edu/IOC for up-to-date information with that. And with that, Graham, do you want to?
I just want to thank the audience for taking time to watch and listen. And above all, I want to thank Pam and Christy for giving their time and joining us.